Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Catholic Table Talk Podcast, where everything Catholic is on the table. I'm your host, William Sauber, for another episode this week, episode 47 we are doing today. So thanks for watching on YouTube or Facebook, or just listening on YouTube or Facebook. Today, we have a guest with us. He's come back again to Catholic Table Talk. He taught first time about the Catholic faith, how to defend it, being a Catholic apologist. And we are excited to have him back for his new book called Revolt Against Reality, Fighting the Foes of Sanity and the Truth from the Serpent to the State. It was released last fall and is really taking off. You can find it on Amazon and shop.catholic.com. We have the author of the book, Gary Michuta, coming back with us. Gary, thanks for coming back on Catholic Table Talk.
Hey, thanks for having me back on. This is awesome.
Yeah, really great to have you back on. Like we talked about before you came on, a lot of people have been interviewing you about it. A lot of great reviews I've been seeing about the book. So
Yeah.
we can start off with this. Just what inspired you to write a book? Because you have written so many great books like Why Catholic Bible is a Bigger, Hostile Witness. But what inspired you to write this kind of a book?
Yeah. Well, great question. By the way, here's the book, as I give it a showcase. Yeah. Revolt Against Reality. What inspired me to write this book? Well, I mean, first everything is so crazy. That was the primary motive is, and I finished the manuscript like 2 years ago and things were pretty nutty back then, but it just seems to have accelerated over time. So I wanted to look at the deep roots of the insanity that we're encountering today. And to do that, I wanted to trace the causes back in history. So I didn't want to come up with like a conspiracy theory because I think that would be worthless. And this is how conspiracy theories work, that they use what's called the single cause fallacy. Whenever there is an event, there's always multiple causes. It's very rare that you only have one cause. And so you can stitch together any kind of narrative just by picking one particular cause out of many. So I wanted to avoid that. So what I did was I back engineered the causes. So I started with what's going on today to its immediate causes, and then I traced backwards. So the causes that link my narrative are not so much the primary causes as the causes that have endured throughout time, right? So they're the most far-reaching causes. And I went all the way back to the incarnation, which I believe ultimately all the chaos we have today stems from a denial in one way or another of the incarnation and its implications. But then I realized by the time I got to that point that really a lot of these errors and rebellions against God and sanity and everything else really echoes a lot of the things that are found with the lie that the serpent said to Adam and Eve in Genesis. So I figured, well, you know what, I'll just take the book all the way to the beginning and start with Genesis and then move forward through history. And so that's kind of how it came about.
That's really cool.
Yeah, there's an apologist, Sir Arnold Lunn, who did something similar, but on a much smaller scale. He wrote, I think it was about 50 or 70 years ago, books that what was it? Revolt Against Reason. And I forgot what the other one was called. But basically, he kind of, it was a critique of Victorian materialism. And what he did was he kind of traced the causes, and give us history as part of an apologetic. And I love Arnold Lunn. Have you ever read Arnold Lunn, Bill?
No, I have not.
Oh, you got to read him. He is hilarious. He's so chivalrous and just combative, and he loved doing written debates. And his debates are they are really, really cool, fun things to read. So I've always been a fan of his. So I thought, you know what, I'll do a homage to Lunn, except I'm not just going to do a small like Protestantism or Victorianism, I'm going to, basically look at all the roots to this chaos. So, yeah, so that's the long answer to a very short question.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And it's just, what inspired you to write about it? That's great. When I first saw the book, Gary, my first thought is about the same thing, about all the chaos that's happening today. I got a book by Bishop Strickland, Light to 11. He kind of talks about some of that stuff in there too. But you really deep, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you really dive deep into the revolts. Like you said, from the creation of Adam and Eve in Genesis and the incarnation. Um, can you maybe a little expand on that, on the creation and incarnation?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, man. Well, first, probably a better place to begin is, what is sanity? How do we define sanity and insanity? And I use the correspondence view of truth, that one's sane insofar as what is known corresponds to what is, right? So if I believe that I am holding a book and I actually am holding a book, then that's a sane thought, right? But insanity would be defined as the degree to which what is known does not correspond to what is. So if I'm holding a book and I think I'm actually holding a kumquat, right, then I'm insane, because that what I believe doesn't correspond to how things truly are. And in the beginning was sanity. God creates through his wisdom, through his word, all things. And in the book, I unpack that because he creates through wisdom. That means that wisdom is embedded in everything that exists. So everything is intelligible, everything is knowable. Even the things we haven't discovered yet, we know because God created it, that we can ultimately know it. Which, by the way, is this, that's the faith that science has. You can't prove that scientifically, right? That is a philosophical, religious position. It's not scientific, but science needs that to operate. But anyways, yeah.
We talked about that in class, didn't we, sometime?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this book is, in some ways, a lot of my classes kind of meld together because it's all part of the same whole. So God creates something that images his own wisdom. And so you can see it corresponds to truth there. And of course, he creates rational creatures like Adam and Eve. And in my book, I go into like the deep organization that Genesis gives, some really interesting stuff. And so Adam and Eve lived in accord with how things truly were, and then enters the serpent. And the serpent, it brings about the first revolt against reality, and the first act of insanity. Because if you look at his lie, it's like so many heresies and wrong ideas that happen later on in history is kind of right there in the lie. He tells them that God, what you think God is not really the truth, that Adam first didn't get the right picture of what he was doing, that actually God is holding out on you. He didn't make things in accord to bring about your perfection, but he's holding you back. And so the serpent gives secret knowledge, right? He's given the inside scoop in his lie that, no, this is how things truly are, and they're not how they appear. And it says, if you eat of the fruit, God knows that you'll be like him. And then he says, knowing good and evil. I think in that context, it really means like determining for yourself what is good and evil, right?
Yeah, right.
And within that's this idea that, well, God's law is arbitrary, that God just arbitrarily willed to do certain things for his own motives. And so if you eat of the fruit, you'll be like him, and you can call things good and evil. You could be just like God. And man, you see all those roots out there, like secret knowledge. You find that in Gnosticism. You find it in other areas as well. I mean, all the way through history till today. You have this idea that God's nature is separate from his will. So God can will things or call things different things. It doesn't really matter what they are by their natures. That it goes into Islam and ultimately into Protestantism. And of course, we're seeing the effects of it today. All those things are right there in the fall. And so what I do in the book is I then show how God begins to rehabilitates humanity in the Old Testament. And I don't know if you ever taken any of my courses with theistic apologetics.
I have not, no.
Okay, yeah. So that chapter would probably interest you and other people, because what I show is God has to take baby steps to reinstitute certain ideas into human consciousness. And a lot of atheists today will go to the Old Testament and try to use the Old Testament against Christians and Jews or God believers. They'll say, see, God is horrible, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. He's a savage. He commands people to murder other people. He has slavery, yada, yada, yada. Like that chapter of book, I kind of debunk. Okay. I don't know. Do you want me to stop there? Because you said, let's say the incarnation.
Yep, incarnation.
Yeah. Okay. Before we get to that, let me just do a little quick pit stop, because
Sure.
There's something really interesting that happens in history right before the time of Christ. And like you mentioned, I love studies on the Old Testament canon, the Deuterocanon. That is a very important juncture in religious history, because what happens a couple of 100 years before Christ is the Jews encounter Greek thought, Greek philosophy, and a really peculiar thing happens. That is, Jewish revelation fits in with the best of Greek philosophy. Like there is a parity. There is a friendship between reason, unaided human reason, and revelation, right? So it kind of goes with like a hand in glove. And you can see that in Sirach, you especially see it in the Book of Wisdom. So anyway, that lays the groundwork for the coming of the Messiah, that and many other things that happened during that period. So when God's people has been prepared to the point where they're willing to lay down their lives in order not to violate God's law, God becomes man. And Billy, that is like a nuclear explosion in terms of human history. The insights just of the fact that God takes himself human nature has radical implications about humanity, about reality itself. The invisible God becomes visible. The infinite becomes finite. And we are all united in Christ as one body. And also we're radically united to each other in Christ. And so this explosion that happens with the insights of the incarnation, like ripple throughout history, and they bring about all these revolutions of thought that otherwise probably never would have happened, like modern science, right? Like Western civilization, the education system, university systems, the intrinsic value of human life, the equality of men, women, children. In the ancient world, women and children were considered the property of the male, the man. They weren't really considered persons. Their whole meaning was tied up into the male of the household. Just radical implications. And that blinding light of the incarnation also caused some people to kind of shrink back from it and try to water it down and kind of bring it back a pre-Christian worldview. And so that's really this series of ongoing revolts that happen from the time of the incarnation all the way till today.
Okay, really.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot there.
Yeah, there is. And I really enjoy, Gary, how you explain it, because it helps me to, it helps me to understand it better. Somehow the way you teach, it really helps me understand it. So I didn't know some of that stuff. So thanks for explaining for us. And just kind of continuing with that point, like you said, God takes baby steps, because, like you said, it first started with the serpent's lie with Eve way back, in Genesis. And like Father Mike Schmitz in Bible Year podcast says, we live in a broken world, and we don't live in a broken world just today as we think about it. Starting way back with creation, you know. So God takes baby steps because we live in a broken world, and He's just taking baby steps one step at a time. So that's what I thought of
Mhm.
when I type out the question for you was,
Mhm.
we all think it's just today or just a few years ago, but it was way back when too. So
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
right.
So basically from there on in the book, I trace both the good and the, how things kind of unfurl from there. So I look at the heresies of the incarnation. Either they deny Christ's humanity or they deny Christ's divinity. I take a long look at Islam, which is very interesting because Islam experiences something that the Jews did before Christ. As they're expanding out of the peninsula, they start rediscovering Greek philosophy and specifically Aristotle. And unlike the Hasmonean period, where the Jews and Jewish revelation and reason kind of go hand in hand, Islam is a train wreck because Islamic revelation isn't amenable to rational thought. And so you have within Islam two parties that one party wishes to place reason above Islamic revelation, and the other party wants to put revelation above reason. And there's some really interesting implications in that. For example, I call it the rational party and the irrational party, right? Because using the Arabic names, people would get mixed up. So the rational party were those that wanted to put reason over Islamic revelation. And Bill, if you look at it, it's very interesting because a lot of the things they say sounds kind of Christian, like that the Quran needs to be interpreted in light of its historical context, that it happens in history. So some things in the Quran may not apply today, that we can know Allah through nature, and even apart from the Quran, you can know what's good and what's bad. It sounds kind of Christian, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I remember that when you were teaching that, it was like,
yeah,
really, really, and you're like, yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah. And then you have the irrational party who says, no, it's you can't know these things because Allah isn't constrained by his will, right? So Allah can will whatever he wants. And so what they do is they separate God's nature from his will. And that's kind of like what you see in the garden, right? With the serpent, with those good and evil stuff that Adam and Eve could do.
right.
And so they'll say, no, Allah can will anything, and therefore you can't know good and evil from nature. The only way you can know is through revelation alone, right? And you can only know that through the scholars who interpret this revelation and apply it. But the rational party had problems too, because they said that everything has to that God is good and does good things because he does so by compulsion. And for anybody in Islam to say that Allah is under compulsion to do something would assume, you can see logically it follow he's not God, right? Because whatever makes Allah do something is God, right? And so they were rightly rejected for that formulation. But the irrational party just destroys the possibility of science. It destroys the possibility of human development because ultimately everything is by the will of Allah. And so secondary causes, okay, disappear. Everything, it's all that the only thing that really matters is Allah's will. And I love this quote from Robert Riley. where he says that he's talking, is a quote from an Islamic scientist, and he says it's un-Islamic to say if you combine hydrogen and oxygen together, you get water. That's un-Islamic. But if you say if you combine hydrogen and oxygen by Allah's will, it becomes water. That's Islamic. So see, it doesn't matter what the natures of hydrogen and oxygen are and their interaction. That doesn't matter. What matters is whatever Allah wills it to be. So you could combine those same two elements and come up with you could come up with gold or silver or a donkey, right? It's all up to Allah's will. You can't do science on that. And also, the same thing with creation. We can't know Allah through creation because God just creates however he sees fit. And he can change his mind. So even revelation can be changed. Verses can be abrogated. And there's all sorts of implications that are packed in this. They deny that human beings are made in image and likeness of God. They promote polygamy. There's all sorts of ramifications, and ultimately, that thought gets imported into Europe, and it becomes part of the school system in Europe. So I don't know if you want me to go into detail or.
Yeah, if you want
Yeah,
to. If I'm not taking
sure.
much of your time,
So
yeah.
I'm not going to give you all the background. You guys can please pick up the book. My family would appreciate the income, but it's all there. And basically, there's a school called Ockhamism that William of Ockham said basically that God's not constrained by his nature, right? His will is disconnected from his nature. And so it doesn't matter what a thing is. He said God could have crucified a donkey and it would have sufficed for the salvation of the world, because God could have just said that that's sufficient and it would have been sufficient. This becomes what's known as nominalism. Okay, nominalism denies universals, denies things like abstractions, triangularity, things like that. And the only thing that matters is individual things. That's the only thing we can know. We can't group them together, because if we do that, it's just simply a name we put on a group. There really isn't something that binds them all together. But probably a better way to think about it is in terms of will, that God can will anything. And it's just a matter of what God calls it that matters. Martin Luther, when he comes on the scene, the religious system was soaked with this nominalistic thought. And if you look at what Luther teaches, very similar. You could see all sorts of nominalistic implications. Like he says, when God makes us righteous, he doesn't actually change us. All he does is call us righteous. He puts the name on us, and we still remain the same. But what counts is what God calls us, right? So you can see how nominalism is even within his understanding. And again, just like in Islam, where Islam becomes kind of restricted to a religion of the book, because the only way you know God is through revelation. Even in Protestantism, you get sola scriptura, right? That everything has to be from revelation alone, in scripture alone, as interpreted by Luther. So, I mean, all these things suddenly starts getting into Christianity. And the one thing, Bill, that nominalism does, it tends to divide things into increments, right? Because immediately once Luther comes on the scene, what happens? Everybody revolts from Luther, right?
Right.
Yeah, because for Luther, it's like, I say there's two things going on with Luther. It's this righteous rebel, right? I will stand up against the historic church because I believe this to be true. So, I'm on a righteous cause. And the other one is purity of doctrine. I can go against the historic church because of purity of doctrine. And immediately Luther's followers start using those same two things to separate from Luther, right? Because they believe that they're right and their cause is just, and they believe Luther's doctrine isn't right. So they'll separate from Luther. So like nominalism tends to divide and separate. break things down into individuals. And so it's no surprise that once this idea becomes part of a movement outside of the church, it starts dividing. And during this time, church and state are united, right? It's state churches that are on the scene. So when the faith begins to be fractured, you start having civil unrest. And what breaks out is all these civil wars, right? Religious wars. Not only Catholics against Protestants, but Protestants against Protestants. And so that sets up like this horrible time in Europe where you have this constant division and fighting, and the faith becomes reduced down to propositions. And that's another thing too. So they go to war over propositions. And so people start thinking of the faith not as this, this explosion of revelation that was handed on to the church from the incarnation. It's seen as just a list of beliefs. And so from that point on, I think humanity it tries to find a way to unify everybody apart from the incarnation. Okay, so it either they dumb down things, make it blurry, so it's so blurry everybody could sign on, or like in deism, they basically say, well, if we have only a limited amount of propositions, then everybody can sign on. So if you believe these 4 or 5 things, all of humanity could be united under those basic propositions. And that's deism, right? Revelation doesn't matter. Everything exterior is bad and wrong. What matters is just mental propositions. I'm basically giving you a mini course here. I just realized that. But all of the stuff, just as it works throughout time, Bill, what happens over and over again is, because it's built on a wrong foundation, and you can't unify people apart from the incarnation, it's just every solution causes new problems. And it just continues to steamroll, right? Where things start to kind of come apart. And so the outward physicality of the church gets reduced to an inward spiritual disposition or mental disposition, right? So that's when you start getting a lock. And by the way, and this affects politics as well, right? Because it's the state's best interest to keep the peace. And Locke says, well, we could divide things into the secular and religious spheres, right? And we can have all the exterior things that are part of the world, like life, liberty, property, things like that. That can be secular under the earthly government, princes and so on. And religion becomes all those interior propositions that are only between individuals and God. Okay. And he makes it so that there's like an iron wall that separates the secular from the religious. And that was his attempt at bringing about peace and unity, right? It was, everybody can go to their own churches and believe their own interior beliefs. But as far as worldly things, well, then we work together for the Commonwealth. And it's January, right? Right to Life Month. And we know that, these propositions were arbitrary, Bill. I mean, like life. When does life begin? When can life be ended? How should it be ended? Who counts as a human being? All these things aren't secular things to be determined by governments. These are philosophical and religious questions, right? So really what Locke was doing was stealing all these very important fundamental ideas and transporting them into a kind of secular compartment where politics can determine these things. And we're left with our own interior spirituality, right? And of course, that goes throughout history and it becomes magnified and so on. So that kind of brings us up to like the 1800s.
Oh, that's really great.
Yeah. And yeah, so today that's what we find ourselves in, right? Is this secular versus religious, that religion is just this interior thing that you can keep to yourselves in your own private lives, but has no relation to the outside world. Um, yeah, and Protestantism too has de-evolved to the same kind of thing. That what is salvation? Well, it's by going through the four spiritual laws, right? It's a change of mind. It's kind of a Gnosticism, right? Because you save your soul, but the things of the body doesn't really matter, right? At least in some areas of Protestantism. Um, that comes about in my book. And I guess I'll probably stop there as far as the dissertation. But then I started moving into today, and in my book, Bill, I do some things I'd never done before. I talk about Vatican II, some really controversial things there. Not my view, but I do talk about the role Vatican II has had in this revolt against reality, actually the spirit of Vatican II. I talk about the radical feminist movement. I talk about gender identity movement. I talk about just lots of craziness that how those two interact and the incoherence of trying to adopt those things. And when I finished the book, originally I ended it in chapter 13. And Bill, it was so dark and so bleak. I couldn't end it there because I thought, man, this is really, it was a great ending, but it was really dark ending. So I added a chapter 14, and it's called Reality Strikes Back. Because even back a couple of years ago, I noticed that, you could dismiss reality, you can sweep it under a rug, but ultimately it's there because it's the only real thing there is. There is no other game outside of reality, right? And so even though all these crazy things are happening today, there are things that even back then I noticed you can't, you can't dismiss, and there's reasons for hope too. So I ended with 14 and go through all those some of the things I saw. And actually, I'm really pleased because 2 years after the fact, I noticed that a lot of my points that I made back then have actually continued to grow, and so I think it has good not only explanatory power, but it's also good predictive power too. That I expect these things to probably become more and more important as time goes on.
Sure. Yeah, that's good. That's I don't know if that's I guess that's good news that it's expanding it.
Yeah,
But just mentioning what you said about Luther. My first thought was what happened when Luther left the church. I just thought of chaos. I don't know if that's the right word for it. Probably, like you said, I guess the revolt is the better word for it. Because like like Jesus saying, if you build your house on not on sand, not a solid foundation, it just the storm comes and blows it down, like you say. And then people left Luther because they thought their ideas worked, and so on and so on. Well, if it's not a solid foundation, it doesn't work. So I really like how you explain that there. And
yeah,
and I really like the mini course that you took too, because like you're saying, you said mentioned the Vatican too, gender stuff, all that. It's what we're talking about today. So
yeah,
it's great stuff to read about and learn about.
yeah.
So
Yeah, so it's interesting to see how these threads go through history, right?
right,
Because, like I said, one thing goes after another. Let me give you an example. Like way back in, I think it's the 4th century, you have Julian the Apostate, who is the last pagan emperor of Rome, who wants to bring back paganism because Christianity has just overcome paganism. One thing he does is he sees that the Christians feed the poor, take care of the poor, and pagan temples they were indifferent to them, right?
right,
So he actually he commands the pagan priests to start feeding the poor, that come to their temples, and he supplies government subsidies to do it. right? And of course it fails because loving everybody, feeding the poor, taking care of the sick, that's part of the DNA, Judeo-Christian DNA, right?
Right.
It's part of a supernatural charity that God has unleashed through the incarnation. So it's natural for us to do this because this is part of the mission. This is how we're going to be judged, right? Whether or not you fed the poor, fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and so on. It was DOA when it came to paganism because it was just the force of the state that made it possible. Okay, take that. Go to Luther. Okay, Luther within Protestantism as it continues, what happens is the Protestants begin to suppress the monasteries. Okay, they take over the monasteries. What were the monasteries? The monasteries were basically a way in which Catholicism used the economics of scale in order to serve the poor on a whole different level than just mere individuals. Okay, that's where hospitals came about. They were originally like monasteries, came through the monasteries, poorhouses, distribution of food for the poor. All of this was through the monastery system, right? So when you get to Henry VIII, even before Henry VIII, they begin to suppress the monasteries. What happens is they get a lot of money because they take over the monasteries to get the property and so on. But now the poor has no one to feed. So you have a crisis of people who are poor that aren't being cared for. So what happens is they enact the poor laws in England, where they tax parishes to pay for taking care of the poor. And you fast forward that to World War II, the poor laws become transformed into the modern welfare state, right? And then, you fast forward to today and you see the mess that we're in terms of taking care of the poor. People are treated as impersonal widgets, and they fall through the cracks, and it's a burden for the taxpayers. All this was kind of, part of that little thread that runs through, if you substitute Christian charity with a kind of mandate, right, you end up with the problems we have today. And also that comes out of this, you have Malthus, right? Thomas Malthus, I think it is, who basically looks at the poor as a problem, right? Because if you allow the poor to continue, if you keep feeding the poor, they're going to get bigger. And the bigger they get, the more you're going to have to feed them. And then all of a sudden, no one's happy because there's the stress, because no one has enough food because they're overrun by poor people who aren't working. And, so they start targeting the poor as a problem. And that comes into this whole anti-life thing, where, we can eliminate the undesirables by contraception and then eventually abortion. And now today you got, I'm sure you've seen it on the news. I mean, there's crazy stuff where, people don't want to have kids because the environmental footprint that humanity leaves on the planet, that it's more merciful to the planet not to have children, this whole anti-life thing. That was all part of that little thread, where supernatural charity is replaced by a kind of mandate, and then people hate the mandate and they begin to hate the poor, right? So.
Oh, that's a great example. I never look at it that way. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So it's like my book has like all these threads, right? All these interesting threads that are out there. Like there's things where in Islam, they bring up things that later David Hume brings up, right? Who's an Enlightenment thinker. I mean, it's very interesting, and it just keeps developing and branching out. And when you come to today, you can see where all the chaos is, because we're standing at the end result of a long stream of errors that just continue to unroll, right?
Right. Oh, that's really true. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So, moving on, we talked about, like you said, the revolt, some down to that example and everything to today, because it stuff just keeps happening. That's just the world that we live in today. And like I said, it's a broken road. Um, I'm gonna take a white tone lane here, a white tone.
Okay.
Talked about the revolts in the book somewhat, but which one? I'm just gonna surprise you here. Which one was your favorite to write about and do? Like you said, okay, I can't wait to put this one in my book.
Yeah, good question.
So sorry about late notice, but
Yeah. I mean, all these pieces were kind of already out just from my own research and things that I've read.
right,
I think the most exciting thing was trying to fit the pieces together, right? To kind of back engineer things. Because as I was doing that, I started noticing even more connections that were visible that weren't visible before I started putting the pieces together. And I think that is the coolest thing. In fact, even today, Bill, I've, because I'm doing interviews, I have to keep this stuff fresh in my mind. So I've been rereading my book because, yeah, I finished it a couple of years ago. It just took a long time for it to get the press. That as I'm rereading the book, I'm seeing even more connections, throughout history. So I could tell you that the most difficult part was that the 13th chapter, the current revolt today, because it's so nutty and incoherent,
yeah,
and the thing is, it's getting worse. It's getting worse. And what I think happened, and I think why it's like an exponential drop rather than a gradual drop, it seems like the floor just went out underneath us and we're in free fall right now, is because of the Catholic cultural momentum that was embedded in Europe. See, all that, the incarnation created this momentum that built civilization. And that momentum continued even though people revolted against it. Okay. And so people could make some very drastic errors. And yet it seemed like, well, the sky didn't fall. Everything seems to be working okay. Maybe this is an improvement, right? And that you keep going on and you keep adding more and more and more. And then, today I think cultural momentum is starting to wane in a big way. And we don't have that cultural momentum that sustains truth and sanity. And so as that wanes, and it's going to be exponential, the insanity is going to increase exponentially because we no longer can rely on, well, no one in their right mind would do this, right?
yeah.
And because people it obviously do believe this, and they're believing crazier and crazier things.
Yeah, that's true. I'll have to agree with you on that one. It just seems
Yeah.
like one day is worse than the other one, just crazy stuff that people think or what I think, or it's all over the place.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Here's a great example. This is just recent history. There was a popular play called the Vagina Monologues, okay, which was like this radical feminist play that was really hip, and like liberals were really for it. And there was all sorts of controversy with Catholics having this play and so on. You remember that?
I think I remember something about it.
Yeah. It's yeah. But anyway, it was like the hip, cool thing to do, right, for the left. Today, it is considered like hateful to have that play. It's considered inappropriate and extreme. Hostile. I'm trying to think of words, right? It is now something that you would never ever do, right? And never say that you like. Why? Because it insists that to be a female means to have certain reproductive organs. And that's part of the title and the premise of the play. And this was only like, what, 10 years, if that you go from something which is incredibly high value to something that's utterly anathema, right?
Right.
And there's all these, it's to the point where it's like every week it just seems there's just another insane proposition popping out. And and you can see in that a war against biology. And I guess since we opened the can of worms, you could see with the gender identity movement, this idea of the will is separated from nature. We kind of become like the nominalist God we serve. And so I can choose by my own will what I am, male, female, or non-human, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that's what matters, is my will, not what I am biologically by nature or essence, right? I mean, it even goes down to pronouns, whether it's hateful to call somebody by a pronoun that agrees with their biology,
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's again, that's that thread. It just goes throughout history, and we're reaching the illogical conclusions of that era.
Right. Yeah. I think I remember that play, but I think the one I was thinking about was was it the WD, whatever, the Russian scandal that we talked about in class. That was
Okay.
the play I was thinking of, but
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
So
yeah, and there's all sorts of other things too, like that at one time was very hip and radical and cool because it was part of the agenda. Now it's anathema, it's backwards, it's horrible. You'll get canceled if you
yeah,
even partake of it. I mean, that's how radical things have changed.
right. It truly has. Just talking to my parents or my grandparents at college, and they used to tell you about the old times, and I talk about today, and they're like, it's just completely different. It's just getting more and more crazy.
Yeah, even just a couple of years ago,
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's accelerating. It'd be interesting to see if we reach a point where people realize we just can't sustain society this way. I mean, what's really scares me, Bill, is that we're enacting legislation, laws, using terms that haven't, the culture's still redefining them. And you can't have a law where you have a blank space where you just fill in whatever is current today,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the whole fabric of the legal system, I think, is in jeopardy unless we get our act straight.
Right. Yeah.
Excuse me.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think it would be, like you said, if we get to the point where people think about it more and find out, I think that'd be, I might be more rock bottom, I guess. But to me, wouldn't that be a good thing? Because then people would realize that.
Yeah, it's just what is, I don't see, I'm not sure what people say. What's the tipping point? When are we going to reach something that's so insane that everybody snaps out of it and figures, wow, we got to get back to where we were?
Right.
I'm not sure there is a tipping point. It's like we're all on this crazy train,
Yeah.
heading to an insane destination. I think really what needs to be done. See, if it continues the way it is, we won't have civilization. And at that point, I think it'd be too late. By the time people realize something's seriously wrong, we won't be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So perhaps a best solution, and I wrote this book basically to start the conversation, to get Catholics thinking about this and trying to come up with ideas of how we can preserve Christianity, Catholicism, civilization, all as one unit. I think ultimately the only thing that's going to survive intact is the church, right? It's faithful Catholics, and because we're based on reality, we're based on Christ, and like I said, reality is the only game in town. There's no alternative to reality. It's the only thing that's truly permanent is the real. And so, that's one comforting thing, is that no matter how crazy things get, we're standing on the rock, like you mentioned scripture about building on sand. Well, we're built on rock, right? And so we could withstand the storm that's going on. But the mission really is to make sure our house is in order and to help others get into our house, right?
Yeah.
Sure. And so to your question about when that point will be achieved, I don't know. we'll see. Yeah.
Well, I like that. So I like you did a good at. So there, I would have to agree with that. So yeah, the book again is Revolt Against Reality. I'll put the link up for shop.catholic.com up in the description. So it's only 320 pages. It's 14 chapters. You get an extra chapter because Gary did another chapter because you couldn't leave it like that. So we get another great chapter to read. And just I know we're kind of going short on time, but I mean, you got great reviews on it from just people weighing in, telling that they can't put the book down. They love the book. It really fits in, like we talked about, to today's standards, all that stuff. So it's a must get. I know if you listen to this soon, the holidays have just passed. If you're listening to this more in the future or repeating this, holidays could be coming again or will be coming. So get for then. Otherwise, if you have birthdays, get for your birthdays, or if you host a youth night at your parish, maybe this might be a good book to start handing out. But really, really great stuff. And like I said, I have not purchased this yet. It's on my wish list. So I promise you, Gary, I'll get my copy very soon.
Awesome.
But yeah. So I know, I guess finishing up, you talked about the one thing that you kind of learned about it was reading it. Just to find more connections. Is there anything else? I mean, I know you say you got done with it 2 years ago, but just something that's really stood out to you.
Yeah, there's so much. You mean from the book?
From the book,
yeah, from the 14th chapter. One very interesting thing in my 14th chapter was I noted that Islam is kind of becoming more, at least the Islamic State's more and more Christian friendly in a way, because they have to modernize and update, and they can't without importing people. So like Saudi Arabia, very, very, of course, the center of Islam has an enormous amount of immigrants, non-Islamic immigrants living in country in order to do the technical stuff to keep the country running. And so I note in my book that there was rumors at the time that Saudi Arabia was going to allow the first mass to be celebrated in its territory for these immigrant workers to go to, which of course Christianity, Islam is the religion there, so it's like a crack. Bill, recently there's some very interesting stuff that's going on where one of the princes in Saudi Arabia is proposing a modernization of Islam, and which he's going to reject like some of the Wahhabi school of Islam, which is like the most strict. He's going to not allow a vast majority of the oral traditions, the hadiths, not to be entered into law cases. And, he's kind of really pulling back on Islam in general within Saudi Arabia and trying to modernize it, update it, so that was really cool because it's like and this is fairly recent where they're proposing all this. So, it's like you can't survive very long without this Christian momentum, right? Because Saudi Arabia has an enormous amount of money, but it needs to be updated radically just because the belief system has held them back. And I think the leadership's starting to understand that they don't want to live in the 7th and 8th century. They want to live like with modern technology.
Right.
So yeah, lots of cool stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Did not know that. So once again, thanks for telling that, because not keeping up with Saudi Arabia. So I guess I should. So
yeah.
All right. But I think that we covered everything that we wanted to cover. So once again, it's Revolt Against Reality, Gary Michuta's newest book on the market. Find out at shop.catholic.com. Description is in the comments below. Gary, thank you so much again for coming on the show. I always can't wait for it. I got friends who watch the show from Homeschool Connections too, and they can't wait to have you
Nice.
on the show. So
Awesome.
thanks for coming on.
All right. Hey, thanks for having me. I'm honored.
That's Gary Michuta, everyone from Harry's on Projects. If you want to get some of other Gary's other books, I'll have the link at GaryMichuta.com as well. Thanks for watching us, listening to us again this week, everyone. We will be back next week with another new episode of Catholic Table Talk Podcast, where everything Catholic is on the table.